The next episode, Fight Outnumbered and Win, to answer the question, that was asked, how do you get the enemy to come to me? I call this part 2. The first episode, I introduced a turning movement. Now what that is when you attack something dear to the enemy and they have to turn out of their defensive positions and then attack into you. So you're basically doing an offense to get to a defense. And then the enemy is in a defense and they have to go into the offense. That's what a turning movement is. All right, so to help out the question my officer asked me is, how do you get the enemy to do this? So now I'm going to take theory and kind of show the applicability of it. So the first way is an old cavalry term called a slashing attack. It's funny, I first read that in this book, Race to the Swift. It was on page 86. And the author goes, he says, yeah, you'll do it just, like everybody knows a slashing attack, just like that. And I was like, everybody knows a slashing attack? I never heard that before. I had to research what the hell a slashing attack is, because apparently everybody knows that but me. Anyway, so I finally figured out what a slashing attack is. So imagine you're blue. Blue goes on a defense. So this has got their blue in their defensive positions. Of course, like everybody, 2 up, 1 back. They have their boundary. So they set up their boundary. Here's the battalion boundary. Here's this battalion boundary. What the Russians do, they call the slashing attack, is when they align their line of operation, their attacking line of operation, to run straight down someone's boundary. And they bypass the defensive positions and they turn in, usually at depth, they call 18 to 20 kilometers where their mark would be, and they attack your headquarters, your artillery, and your logistics. So what a slashing attack is when you align your line of operation down your enemy's boundary. So the idea is, where is your weak point in the defense? Well, there's lots of them, but one that will always be weak is where 2 elements come together. Their boundary, the joint.
Is that just because of like the split between command and control of those elements? Like no one's taking ownership of it?
Yeah, so hey, who's got that road? If you have a boundary running down the road, which rookie mistake, draw your boundary down a road, well then it's like, hey, who's got the tanks coming down the road? They do.
Right.
And you take advantage of it. So rookie mistake, don't ever drive your boundaries down roads or down the middle of rivers, because you're opening up a joint.
Sure.
Very jiu-jitsu-y that if you attack somebody, they're weak at the joint, they're weak at their shoulder, and that's kind of the idea.
Okay.
So how do you get the enemy to come at me? Well, one way because the question we're trying to answer, how do you get there? How do you get in their rear area? How do you get to where you're attacking something there? One way is find the enemy's boundary. There's lots of ways you guys can figure all that out. But once you find the boundary, you attack down it. And then you bypass their defenses and you get behind them and you start attacking their headquarters, their artillery, that's very dear to them.
Right.
Their BSA, as you said, and that will cause them to have to turn out and deal with you. So that's a slashing attack.
Okay.
The next one is a 5th column. I don't know if you ever heard of a 5th column. If you get into a lot of academic reading, you're going to hear this. A 5th column refers to a non-uniformed, like a partisan, or it's more of a special forces type, guerrilla force.
Right.
Usually they're actually regulars.
Sure.
And they go in way beforehand the war starts. And they will immediately start seizing capitals. They'll start seizing, the police stations. The Germans did this big in the invasion of Poland of 1939, especially up in Danzig, or it's now Gdansk. So they sent in a non-uniformed kind of a clandestine force en masse to seize all these key locations. The Russians did that in the season of taking Crimea. Have you ever heard the Little Green Men? That's what you'll hear as a 5th column. They go before the war is declared, and they'll immediately start gaining a lot of these very positions as dear to them, and force the defenders to have to attack into them. And that's what they did in like I said, in Danzig in 1939. That's what the Russians did in Gdansk. They also call that a fait accompli. A fait accompli is a military strategy when you just do it immediately and the other people have to put up with, live with the consequences.
Right, it's so fast that you can't actually do anything about it. You just have to live with the result of it.
Correct. For example, did anyone see me ask permission to put the stickers on my stairs? I just did it, and everyone has to live with it.
They look good.
That's a fait accompli.
They look good.
Okay, so that is how you can get there. Is before, when things escalate, everyone LD, if you can send in a force beforehand, and then seize key positions and cause them to attack into you, that's also how you get there.
Okay.
Usually American forces, we're not big into fifth columns because that tends to be seen as illegal, but that's what that is. So they'll say, why did we have airborne air assault positions? Well, the airborne and the air assault position, or air assaulting, really came from this idea. How do you get there? How do you get there? So if you look at the invasion of Normandy, why did we employ airborne forces?
To get around to that point, exactly.
To gain the bridges, to gain key intersections. How do you get there? How do you bypass the enemy defenses and turn them out and have them attack into you, or to gain it for other reasons, but mostly for that. So that's what the airborne was about. In Vietnam, that's where they really start experimenting with helicopters. The problem you'll have when you start trying to do envelopments or turning movements is this thing of speed. For example, if I'm driving 20 kilometers an hour and this force turns and starts driving 20 kilometers an hour, we're just keeping up with ourselves. See, we're not, or even two people walking. I used to be in the border patrol and I would try to catch people and they would start running and I would start running and I could never catch the distance. And they'd start walking, I'd start walking, and you're just in this never gaining on each other. Same idea here. If you're trying to maneuver on somebody, this whole idea of speed becomes the problem. So that was what the helicopter was revolutionary, because now you could put a force on a helicopter and they could bypass all the defenses and get behind and land and force the enemy to attack into them. They call that a vertical envelopment. If you watch We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson, that's what LZ X-ray was always about. He bypassed all that terrain and got to the enemy's rear area, and it turned out the NVA, and they started attacking into him. If you remember, he was always surrounded, and they were coming at him. And he did quite well because he was in a stationary position, and the NVA was coming at him.
Well, it'd be interesting to see, too, how this continues to, because, you go airborne and then air assault in Vietnam, like that technique may continue to develop, too, in the future conflict.
Well, people want to do that, but now we have such a robust anti-air threat, it becomes really difficult. So that's another way you can get there. So you're trying to get behind them. So the slashing attack, a fifth column, airborne air assaulting. So then you have infiltration. So another way is, all right, well, instead of doing a very dynamic move, what if we broke down into small squad-sized teams and each moved on their own path, and if they make contact, they go around or they have battle, but these guys keep going and you quit worrying about your flanks. And they keep going and they keep going to get to the rear area, and they keep going and they don't actually fight the forces they encounter, but they get to the critical vulnerability. And they lose stealth, quiet, a lot of diversionary fires. That's what the Germans did in World War I at the end. They call those stormtroop tactics. So if you ever hear stormtroop tactics, that's what the Germans were trying to invent. Was they, instead of trying to attack the enemy positions frontally, they would bypass in small teams to get what's most dear. It worked really well because it would turn out their defenses and cause panic. So infiltration. By the way, I tried an infiltration at NTC one time, failed miserably. I learned right there, doing an infiltration without fires does not work. So pro tip, trying to infiltrate without suppressive fires does not work. You can try it. I already did. Doesn't work. Okay. So you have an infiltration. Next is counterpunching. So I've been a big person that believes in counterpunching. So counterpunching, and you can do a video later. The whole idea is with a counterpunch is when someone throws a punch, they open up.
That side.
They're going to open up something, right? So when two boxers actually go to fight, they're actually pretty hard to find a place to fight or hit them. I mean, they're covered up. They got their elbows in. It's hard to find a place to hit them. The time when somebody becomes the most vulnerable is when they throw a punch. So like if you threw a right, you're probably, if I said slip it, your liver punch comes open. So when I throw my right, my critical vulnerability becomes exposed. So I need to bait you to throw a punch. So if I know that, and if I can try to bait you to throw your right, and I can slip it, that's called counterpunching. I know this because in Poland, I got the crap beat out of me by this Croatian MMA fighter, and I couldn't realize why he's beating me up so much. He started counterpunching me. It got to the point where I didn't want to punch anymore because every time I'd punch, I'd get hit right back.
Right.
What I mean by that is, so how do you get them to come at you? So if you have your enemy and you're attacking them, what you got to do is you hit at them and then fake that you're culminated or you stopped or they won. And then they will, after you hit somebody, what do? They immediately hit back. So again, if I jab you, you're going to hit back, and then I counterpunch. The same idea is I attack into the enemy knowing that I'm not really trying to attack them to destroy them in their place, to bait them to hit back, and then I destroy them there.
Well, and that's, we used to call that like a hit and fade. And so you would hit an enemy somewhere and then draw them into a place that you want to fight them on your own terms.
Exactly.
And so it's like a really like speed, surprise, violence of action, all the above get thrown at them here to pull them back to a place where you want to
So
take them
for you
out.
company commanders out there, sometimes we see the enemy in place and we got to fight them in that location, expend all the resource. What if that you follow the enemy in place and you're attack and maneuver on them, and then you bait that you've culminated. You bait that they've won. And then you're like, oh, get on your radio and you start raying that you're fade disorder. Well, that enemy is inevitably going to what?
Pursue.
They're going to attack you. If you set in your defense in that moment, they're coming at you. And that's when you win.
Nice.
So, and the Mongols would do this with the old lure and trap. So the Mongols, they mastered that where, this is the old Mongol trick, is the Mongols would attack into the enemy. They would have a big, here's their enemy. They would have a big, fight, and the Mongols would then fake that they lost. And they would turn and they would just start retreating, not too fast, but not too slow.
Right.
And the enemy, thinking they'd won, would follow them. Now, when you follow somebody, do you stay in a cohesive element? No. You start stringing out. You start becoming a column. People get tired. You start getting stragglers. And the Mongols would just keep going back and keep going back and keep going back. We don't like to do this because somewhere in our military mindset, moving backward equals losing. Well, the Mongols didn't think that way.
Right.
They were focused on destroying their enemy. And sometimes this withdrawal would last for 2 or 3 days and just exhaust the pursuers until they would draw them in to an ambush. And they would draw them in. The attacker would be strung out at that point. And then they would destroy him.
Would they harass them on the way, or would they just try and entice them back to that point?
Feign disorder, feign tired, feign,
Okay.
But they wanted them to be exhausted and pursue them. The Mongols did this all the time. And it was always amazing to me how many people fell for it, because they do it all the time. And you'd see the American Indians in the Plains Indians do this as well. So that's the lure and trap. And then penetration and reconnaissance pull, meaning that sometimes like in my previous example, you'd actually have to penetrate. And the way you set up a penetration is what you have to do is you have to draw your boundary really narrow and force, if this is your enemy here, you have to gain local superiority in a small area. And you force that by drawing a really small boundary, and that'll force all your forces to stay tight, and you can mass on somebody. And then once you penetrate, then you expand out.
Right.
And the way to find a place to penetrate, you have to use reconnaissance pull. We'll do a video on reconnaissance pull because it's an important concept. But basically, reconnaissance pull is instead of predetermining which way you're going to go, you don't know which way you're going to go. You're going to let your reconnaissance pull you and tell you which way you should go, where the weak point is.
So in a lot of ways, that has like similarities to archery hunting, like bow hunting. if you're trying to take down a bigger animal with a bow, you'd want a heavier grain weight head and a heavier shaft and something like you have to balance that flexibility with that weight to give that impact and make sure you got the right draw weight. So in that same way, you're kind of stacking an element into a heavier arrow to penetrate.
Yeah, because in a penetration, you have to have overwhelming combat power at a small point.
Right.
And so sometimes it's hard to do that. So a way as an officer to do it is draw really narrow boundaries. And you force everybody into a small kennel. Anyway, that's for a different point. But what I want to talk about, to answer your question, how do you get the enemy to come at me? Some of the best principles you can apply is, well, find their joint, find their, attack down their boundaries to get to their rear area, then turn in. Fifth column, you know, I guess if warfare gets that dicey for us, we might have to think about that. You know, there's airborne and air assaulting. That's what they're about, to do a vertical envelopment to get to the rear area. There's an infiltration, break into small units to bypass their defenses, get to their rear area, so they have to turn out. Again, pro tip, don't do it. Think you can do it sneaky anymore. You have to combine it with suppressive fires. There's counterpunching, you know, where you just jab, move, and hit. So force them to come at you by jabbing. There's a lure and trap. And then really, if you penetrate one place, overall combat position, combat power at a small point, that allow you to move forward and get to what's dear to them. And that's a lot of, this is really, infiltration and penetration was a lot what Blitzkrieg was all about. Okay, anything else you want to add?
No, sir.
All right, thanks for watching. Fight Outnumbered and Win.